I'm waiting for Senator Brady to come back in the room. I need to make an announcement. Apparently, they decided in all their wisdom between 10 and 12 today to do alarm testing in the building. And
For a whole lot of times at
lights will
once.
flash and the whole, it'll be annoying.
So we need to leave.
We do not need to leave. You might want to.
I'm gonna leave.
Because-
I'm not staying, Trevor.
Oh, Jenny, you're always making trouble.
So I apologize in advance. It's gonna be.
Such a rebel.
It's gonna be. Hi, Senator Lyons. All right.
Thank you for letting me zoom in today. It's great.
Are you home or at your cottage?
I'm at my camp because I'm driving down to Bennington tomorrow and it's a little bit closer, so I'm trying to do less driving.
Okay. All right, well, we're gonna get started. Senator Brady can catch up. Welcome to Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules on June 13th, 10 o'clock. And before we get started here, I'd like to go around and make introductions. My left.
Morning, I'm Damian Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel.
Beth Baumgartz, representative for Bennington 4.
Chris Bray, I live in Bristol and represent Addison Senate District in the Senate.
I'm Carol Odie, I'm a representative of Chittenden 18.
And I'm Mark Higley and I represent the Orleans Lamoille District.
David Weed, Senator representing Rutland County.
Mark McDonald, Senator representing Orange County, with the exception of a few towns on the very corners.
Representative Trevor Squirrel and I represent Underhill and Jericho on Zoom with us today.
Jenny Lyons, Senator representing Chittenden Southeast.
And over here.
Charlene Ditter, committee assistant.
I'm Lindsay Schreier, administrative assistant.
Okay, welcome everyone. Okay, first on the agenda are the minutes from May 16th, 2024. Senator Bray.
And move approval of the minutes for May 16, 2024.
Motion to approve. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, thank you. First rule up today is 23-22, State Board of Education Rule Series 2000, Education Quality Standards Review of Rule and request for adoption deadline extension. So there are two pieces of this. We want to take up the extension first. We'll be done with that. Okay. We have a request from to the adoption deadline was going to be June 21-24.
That's the requested extension date.
Oh, okay. So
The adoption deadline itself, I believe, was the 8th.
what's the request?
The request is to extend it to June.
So moved.
Okay. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, and, so the rule itself, we have it must be Kim, I'm Sarah. So Kim Gleason, member, State Board of Education, and with her is Sarah Buck, special counsel. Welcome both.
Good morning. Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to do, if it's fine with all of you, I'm going to do a brief overview. We've sent a few things, but an overview, and then I'll field your questions if that makes sense. Good morning. And for the record, I'm Kim Gleason, co-chair of the EQS Committee of the State Board of Ed. I'm joined virtually by Dr. Tammy Colby, co-chair of the EQS Committee, and Sarah Buxton, outside counsel for the State Board of Ed on these rules, and Jennifer Samuelson, chair of the State Board of Ed, who will be up next presenting the 2200 rule series. We're grateful for the contributions of our EQS committee members, past and present: Patrick Brown, Tom Lovett, Gabrielle Lucci, Mohammed Job, Gray Fearon, and Rich Warner. We're pleased to come before you to respond to any questions you may have regarding the proposed amendments to the Rule Series 2000, otherwise known as the Education Quality Standards, or EQS. These rules address the standards for public schools must meet in order to carry out the state's policy that all of Vermont students will be afforded educational opportunities that are substantially equal in quality and are equitable. The EQS were last updated in 2014. These current modifications were largely driven by the passage of Act 1 of 2019 and technical corrections to modernize the rule to align with current statute and AOE policies. At the April 2022 State Board of Ed meeting, the Act 1 working group, in alignment with their statutory change, presented their proposed revisions of the EQS for State Board consideration. That body of work was informed by the research, diverse experiences, and deliberations of the Act 1 working group members and by guidance from the AOE. The EQS committee reviewed and recommended revisions in the context of the relevant legal framework, careful review of existing statutory requirements, and substantive stakeholder input. Prior to the Lcar filing last May, the EQS committee took testimony over 20 meetings to ensure that the rules were clear as written, that they strike an appropriate balance between enough detail to be understood and enough flexibility to ensure application in a local context, and that they were able to be operationalized in our schools. Since the formal filing, 3 public hearings were held, September 13th and 28th, and October 3rd of 2023. These hearings were attended virtually by 180 attendees. We received 100 written comments, and the public comment period closed on October 25th of 2023. Over 14 meetings, the EQS committee considered each comment and made modifications to the draft as appropriate. On April 17th of 2024, the State Board voted unanimously to approve the EQS for filing with your committee. On behalf of the EQS committee and the State Board of Education, and with gratitude for the contributions and foundational work of all those who've been engaged with this effort, we submit the final proposed filing for the Rules Series 2000 Education Quality Standards for your consideration. I will also say there was a memo sent to you on June 10th that caught some typos. So we'd like to consider that as well as a friendly amendment. And then we're happy to entertain your questions, and we look forward to your approval. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Ready?
Does that conclude your prepared?
Yes, we shared a slide presentation as sort of a framework that elevated the summary of the big package of materials you also got. So unless you would wish, we don't need to go through it, but if you'd wish, we are also prepared to go through it.
What prompted or directed or commanded your work? Which
So and Tammy and Sarah and I will share responsiveness to your questions. I will start with this one and then invite you to jump in. But Act 1 of 2019 included some findings that suggested that we are struggling in our state with the anti-racist, anti-discriminatory delivery in our education systems and more broadly. And so following the directives and intent of Act 1 of 2019, the Act 1 working group had a charge to look at regulation, additional standards, and other areas that needed to be modified and updated to reflect the values espoused and offered through legislative intent with Act 1. So that, I would say, was the biggest impetus. Also, these had not been updated since 2014. So there were other technical alignment with more current statute And in some cases, we brought in language even from existing statute that offered clarification as well.
Good morning. Just if I may add to that, just a point of clarification. So Act 1, right, established this working group, and they're in statute, their requirement was to propose recommendations to the State Board of Education for this rule. And the State Board, in turn, was had a responsibility to review those recommendations and then sort of move forward. So in addition to what Kim said, there was a very specific language within statute that sort of initiated this process for updating the rule for Act 1. But as Kim mentioned, when the rule was opened, it was also appropriate for the state board in partnership with the Agency of Education to make sure that this very important rule, which governs most aspects of public education in the state, to make sure that the rule was up to date for other statutes, other statute changes to statute, as well as existing practice and programs that are in place at the agency.
Some would say that the rules that are proposed have been more, I don't want to use the word generous, but have been more promoted the likelihood of more independent schools rather than fewer independent schools. I don't know if that's correct or not. But my question is, if it does in fact spur more schools, we in the legislature and the board for several years have wrestled with the notion of having fewer schools that would be larger, because and the rationale was, one, that they would have better education opportunities, and two, it wouldn't cost a darn much. These rules appear to reverse that policy and encourage, welcome, and fund with taxpayer dollars more small schools rather than fewer small schools. And as a result, are likely to cost more than the current system. How did you, when you wrestled with your recommendations, how did you treat that issue?
Yeah. So respectfully, I think there are two rules before you. One is the rules that apply to independent schools, and these is the EQS, the Education Quality Standards, which are for public schools. These rules do nothing with respect to independent schools. These rules, are for the quality standards for public schools, and they do not speak to consolidation or school size. They establish sort of the broad curricular and operational framework for public schools in the state. The second set of rules that you'll consider this morning, and Chair Samuelson will speak to, are for independent schools. And I suspect that the question that you're posing probably pertains to that set of rules. And I ask that maybe we can put that question in the parking lot and come back to it in the context of that set of rules, if we could.
So my question is, are these rules likely to increase the number of small schools that are more expensive than schools that contain larger groups of students?
No.
No, and I think I would also add, Tammy, that we actually intentionally threw the rules, so having nothing to do with independent schools, but rather we went through the rules to look at the highest level of governance for each of these standards that was allowable within statute. So operationally, bringing these rules into the schoolhouse will be overseen at the highest level of governance. So if it's SU or school district, there is the responsibility for complying. Every place that we could was held at the highest level of governance. So the notion of it allowing for more smaller schools to thrive or not the responsibility is held at the SU, the supervisory union level, for compliance or the school district level for compliance at every opportunity that we could throughout the rules to ensure that the resources are well aligned across a school district.
I'll give you one example. It's unclear, I think, in statute, or it was previously unclear and inconsistent in statute and in rule, who has the specific responsibility for creating curriculum. And the legislature over the past 10 years has assigned it in 16 VSA 261 to the supervisory union or supervisory district level. So the SUs and the SDs have the responsibility of developing curriculum. The rules now align with that. So when it goes into detail to fill in the gaps about what needs to be in the curriculum and what the standards are, it refers to the SU or the SD rather than the school itself, so that administrators and practitioners aren't confused about who is doing what. In some instances, like maintenance of some kinds of records or some safety practices, those still are at the school level. And so those are specifically retained in these rules. So as Kim mentioned, we went through every instance of what used to say in the rules, schools shall, and we modified it to align with statute and the legislative intent to put the categories of things that are assigned to the SUs and SDs in one bucket and everything that's assigned to a school in the other bucket, and literally go through the rules line by line and make sure that the proper entity is named.
Well, Mr. Chair, on that issue, the public who's interested in schools and their costs and in their curriculums, may they go to the school boards and say, could you share with us the salaries that your schools pay their employees?
This does not address salaries, but in terms of curriculum, they may go to the supervisory union and say, we would like to see a copy of the written curriculum. And that is made expressly clear in these rules.
So having seen the written curriculum, if the curriculum appears to be different or more robust than public schools or absent what public schools are required, what is the recourse of the public in that situation?
You've just hit upon the other big change in these rules. Would you like to?
Yes. Yes. So we require now in the rules that there be a robust process for public feedback. So, and this would have nothing to do with more or less rigorous than independent schools, just simply for as it applies to public schools in the education quality standards, there needs to be a process. School boards and school districts and SUs must have a process that invites public feedback. And that is captured, retained, and submitted in terms of their responses when they report annually to the AOE on their compliance with the education quality standards.
And not only must they report what is the feedback that they receive, but if there are complaints or allegations that the district or the SU are not following through on any education quality standard requirement, that also must be addressed and disclosed. There wasn't previously a very clear complaint process. And this set of rules clarifies that parents, members of a community, the public may bring to the attention at the local level their concerns about the school or the SU or SD's implementation of education quality standards. The local district or the SU has to make an attempt to address it, and they have to report that annually, as Kim mentioned, in their submission to the Agency of Education, which is public.
So when the public
May I add something?
review or make recommendations to the governing the school of such schools, and they go in and say, we don't think you're doing enough in this area, and you should be, and yeah, in that area, you do quite a bit. How much does the principal get paid? How much is spent on this? Where is the money being allocated?
Yeah.
Will the
Yeah.
public receive dollars and cents and names
Budgets.
for
Yeah.
such things? Or may the schools say, that's our business, we're an independent school, we don't have to tell you that?
I'll
Yeah.
let-
What is the law? How does
Yeah.
the law deal with that issue?
Yeah. So public schools, which is right, the universe to which these rules apply, right? Nothing in this rule changes, right, the public responsibility of local school boards to their constituents with regard to transparency around school budgets, salaries, benefits, things along those lines. Right, so this rule does nothing to change the existing responsibilities that public schools have. The other thing I wanted to point out, though, is that, and I want to go back to your comment, sort of, I think you're sort of asking about efficiencies, right? And the legislature has made it very clear over time, as I think you're alluding to, is that the preferred governance structure is much, right? We're trying to create bigger units, right? Because the perception is that those would be more cost effective and cost efficient.
We're not trying to do that. That has been a goal of.
That has been a goal. That
of the
has been a
state for a
goal.
while.
That has been a goal. And so to Councillor Buxton's point, when we went through and revised this rule, we made sure that the unit, right, the unit of governance that is responsible for elements of this rule is the highest unit possible, not the smallest unit. Because if you think about implementing very different curricula across separate schools within a supervisory union is both inefficient and potentially inequitable, right? And so our updates to this rule address that concern directly by putting that responsibility at the highest unit of governance, not the lowest unit of governance. But there's nothing in this rule that changes existing roles and responsibilities of local school boards for public schools with regard to transparency around budgets, staffing, or public access to the process. This rule does not do anything with respect to what is already in play. And again, this rule does not, the rule that we're talking about right now, does not apply to independent schools.
And to answer your question, it does not compel the release of information related to salaries and attaching them to names, but the Public Records Act still applies. And so if districts keep the information and keep a record of who makes what, and they don't voluntarily disclose this in an annual report like they used to, citizens and others may make a public records request and they follow that process. That information is still available. This doesn't compel the release of that information.
So would the public get that information should they request it?
Yes, so long as they make a public records request, yes.
And if the local school says we don't,
we're not. They may say, if a district doesn't keep a record in that form, there isn't a record to hand over. So the Public Records Act doesn't require that you create a record, but I am speculating that most administrative offices probably have a name attached to a salary. And so I would be surprised if such a public records request wouldn't result in the information that you're asking for.
well, we're dealing with rules here.
Yeah.
And we don't like to be surprised at what is likely to happen or
Right.
what we may discover
Right.
happens.
Right.
So if you don't keep a record of that, you don't have to disclose it.
Right. That's right. You
So
don't.
if you went and say, the principal earns, $500,000 to make up that,
Right.
I would imagine that's possible.
It may be worth a $500,000.
We don't have to tell you that, and we don't have to tell you.
I'll defer to counsel here who can probably explain the Public Records Act and how that functions, but it's not addressed directly in this rule because that's addressed under 3 VSA 317.
So if you go to a public school and ask that question,
Yes.
Can I ask, let council speak to that?
Yeah, so for the record, I'm Damian Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel. So by law, employers are required to keep a record of the wage paid to their employees. So there would be a record somewhere in there. There are certain things in personnel records that are confidential, disciplinary proceedings, medical records, things like that. But things like pay for public entities are public records. And they can be requested through the Public Records Act process. If an entity decides to withhold public records, there is a process for appealing that decision. So you can appeal up to a records officer at that agency. And then I am pulling up the Public Records Act here. And
Superior Court.
I believe it's a Superior Court appeal after that, if the agency denies it. And so we're all familiar with this in context of state government, where the state has said, nope, that's not a public record. And then Vermont Digger or 7 Days or the Times Argus has gone to court, said, we think it is a public record. And then the judge sits down and goes through and says, well, this one is, and this one isn't. But salaries are generally a public record. Something like the disciplinary proceeding or investigations may not be. That could be a confidential personnel record. But the salary information and the budgetary amounts allocated to certain programs should be discoverable public records.
shouldn't be.
Yes, they should be.
Does
And
it
there's,
say that in so many words in the rules?
it says it in the Public Records Act.
It doesn't exempt them.
Yeah, this doesn't create a public records exemption. So a public record is any written or recorded information that is produced or acquired in the course of public business, including salaries and benefits of elected and appointed officials and employees of public agencies. And then there are specific exemptions to the Public Records Act, but those salaries, the amounts spent, things like curriculum, that's all a public record. Things like private personnel records when it's relating to, for example, why someone took a medical leave, that is exempt. But yeah, so this is covered under existing law 1 VSA 317. And this rule does not include a public records exemption.
So we may or may not find a situation where the courts are gonna have to rule whether or not the opinion that you just gave holds water.
Right, I mean, statute says clearly individual salaries and benefits and salary schedules relating to elected or appointed officials and employees of public agencies shall not be exempt from public inspection and copying. So that is express statutory language. So that's pretty ironclad there. There are other things where maybe contracting details related to someone who's helping to develop curriculum. There could be things that fall under an exemption, for example, for trade secrets and that sort of thing. But generally the final amount of the contract would be a public record. So the school district spent $500,000 on the contractor here, but the details of the contract itself, there may be portions that are redacted. But the statute is very clear on salaries in particular. If individuals are seeking that, it's not to say that someone might not try to withhold that information, but then there's the courts always look to the legislative language first. If that's clear, the case is over. They settle based on that.
Or the rules derived from the legislative language that is clear.
Right. And if the rules are contrary to that, there is an argument that the rules are superseded by the legislative language, because legislative language always trumps. So if for some reason at some point there were a rule to go through and we didn't catch it in our review here at Lcar and register an objection, But it got to court and the court said, well, the legislative language says salaries and benefits shall be a public record that's open to inspection and copying. And the rule adopted said they shall not be, and there's no legislative basis for that. The court can overrule the rule and follow the statute because the statute is always the supreme law.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair, this is.
The reason we're having this discussion is because that's our job and that's what we do. To find out if the rules are in fact doing what we believe them to do. And run, and runs to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have Senator Lyons and then voting.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna maybe change the topic a little bit. So I'm very thankful for the work that you've done here on racism and race and ethnicity and brought it up to more modern standards. The question that I have really relates to the other problem that we're seeing in schools with children's mental health issues. And the only place that I think the only place that I see reference to something might be the neurodiversity definition that you have, as well as restorative practices. They're on pages 4 and 5. So my question is this: as you were talking about updating the rules, what conversation, if any, did you have about mental health issues? Understanding, of course, that there's there are different ways that different districts are solving the problem. Some are hiring mental health counselors to work alongside other school counselors, and some are relying on our social service agencies, but then some are hiring them on as full-time staff. And the mental health status of kids, obviously, just like the other neurodiversity conditions that you mentioned, are integral to student success. So my question is, how, if at all, was mental health discussed? Or are there plans for moving forward on this in another way? And then my final question is, this continues to be a real interest. Oh.
Could she repeat her
For those
points? Yeah.
We're at an alarm cycle test between time.
Tell me when to finish my last comment.
I just wonder, could she say the 2 points again? Because I missed it because I kept hearing that.
Okay, so the one, so my question was, what conversation was had regarding mental health and its influence on educational quality and achievement for kids. But then my other comment is that my committee is very much interested in this topic, as I know education is as well. And for me, there's always the debate about who's responsible. Is this something that our Agency of Human Services, am I coming through?
I have no idea what the cycle's gonna be like.
I know, it's terrible.
Tell me when to speak.
You speak now.
Okay, so so our committee, as well as education, continues to be interested in mental health issues for kids. And the question I have is, are there any recommendations that you folks are thinking about relative to who is responsible for providing mental health counseling in schools? Should it be an AHS support program, or should we rely on our local school districts to hire or contract out, either hire counselors directly or contract out to our designated agencies? So there are a lot of comments in there, but my original question is, how is mental health included here? And then any thoughts that you've given to mental health and the discussion of the rules, And then finally, any forthcoming recommendations on how we provide mental health services, if at all, in our schools.
Thank you, Senator Lyons. I'll start and then invite Tammy and Sarah to join. The considerations and concerns are certainly raised over conversations of those who came before us to inform the work, and are part of very intentionally a tiered systems of support. That is an area of the rules on page 9, 2120.5. We moved it within the rules to pull the comprehensive supports into one place. Multi-tiered systems of support are not new. They are work happening in our schools, implemented in probably a variety of means, but in that system is inclusive of the mental health supports to help students be prepared to learn. And so specifically at the bottom of page 10, we are referencing as part of this continuum of support for students, the school counseling services, the health services to include mental health supports. And I think pulling that, the mental health supports and the instructional tiering of supports and personalized learning into one section in the document made most sense to us to make it clear that is an expectation. There's a continuum of service that helps students become prepared to learn and then to support the rest of their journey along that learning spectrum. I think addressing neurodiversity is spoken to throughout the document as well. But I think the tiered systems of support section most appropriately addresses it and has been, it was in a few different places, frankly, before in the rules, and we thought it aligned best to pull it all into one section. So hopefully that addresses that question. And Tammy or Sarah, if there's anything else, and then we can do our best at the second part of the question.
Thanks, Kim. I think that's Kim's exactly right. And I think the punctuation I would put on that is by pulling it into one place and sort of it both elevates and sort of highlights the fact that this is an expectation. We know that multi-tiered systems of support are implemented with varying degrees of consistency across the state. This rule makes it clear that multi-tiered systems of support that are robust, educational support systems that include mental health supports are an expectation and a floor that all schools need to have. And that rule is very clear on that. And it's not buried in 6 different places in the rule. It's in one place so that the expectation is clear and it's concise. And the goal again was to establish a floor at a minimum that says this is the expectation that all schools have a robust multi-tier system of support.
I'll expand on that just a little bit and also add that in statute, the legislature has directed that school districts are responsible for multi-tiered systems of support, and that school districts must designate the superintendent or a different designee to be responsible for establishing and being accountable for a district having those multi-tiered systems of support. We pulled that from statute and put that into the rules to make it more clear. I think I'm speaking to your part of the question to say who is responsible. The rules clarify that this requirement must happen at the local level, at the school district level, but that the superintendent is responsible. Title 16 also assigns the agency of education the responsibility for providing guidance, tools, and technical assistance. And so this is creeping a little bit to your second question about who should, whether it's designated agencies or schools, who should be the proper entity assigned to support that work. And I would just posit that the legislature has said this is in the agency's purview. It does not invite the state board to offer rules or comment on, to that extent, this is very much in their responsibility bucket. So I will note that with regard to your question. The other place I wanted to point out some additional connection to mental health supports would be on page 7. A significant addition both in these rules and in the 2200 series includes a requirement that educators be supported in a number of activities. And I think there's probably about 15 here. The language is mirrored, you'll see in both sets of rules, but this also includes providing learning experiences that are designed for neurodiversity with multiple ways for students to access learning, and for using educational and assistive technology to reduce barriers to learning and heighten student engagement. I would expect that many students who are struggling with mental health needs probably also experience a higher rate of absenteeism. And this helps educators through their own professional development and with the support of the school, be able to support students in a variety of ways that perhaps before were going unnoticed and untended to. So those are 2 examples of some places where that was addressed in the rules.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I guess that this, for me, I think we're going to have a further, some more discussion. A couple reasons. One, when you think about multi-tiered systems of support, we're thinking about ACEs and prevention of, trauma-informed services that are more generally applied across the curriculum. When we think about mental health counseling and support services, that becomes much more individualized with caseloads for individuals. And then the question is one of cost, that having schools responsible for on-site counselors is not inexpensive, and that this has been added on gradually over the past several years and will continue until we solve the mental health crisis that we've seen as a result of COVID. So I think all the things that you're saying are terrific. I mean, they're really good, and I'm appreciative of the work that's here. But I still I do have some questions, and I think that perhaps I think our 2 committees may want to just dive into this a little bit more. And I know as the public engagement process on education is going forward, this may fall out as an interesting area of discussion. So, but thank you, and thanks for your work. I appreciate it.
Representative Bodie?
No.
You all set?
Yeah.
Senator Weeks?
First, thank you for your efforts on both this set of rules and the next set of rules. And I know that both topics got a great deal of attention in, well, actually both health and welfare and the education committee in both houses. And I'm wondering though, if there was a characterization given from the chairs of the 2 education committees on the nature of the rule, if they support it, or if that's germane to the conversation.
Yeah, I'd asked that question of our committee assistants, and we did not receive letters from either chair.
Okay, thank you.
I'll move adoption. It's with the modifying. It's a couple of technical corrections, right?
Yes, so,
As amended, you will then vote for amendment on to, right?
yes.
Giving you honey.
Don't have to be quick, Senator McDonald.
That's when we make mistakes. Mr. Chair,
Security alert, immediately initiate your run, hide, and fight action plan and seek refuge in a safe location.
Mr. Chair, the public, I believe, generally understands the principles behind how we pay for students to go to school.
Security alert, initiate your run, hide, and fight action plan and seek refuge in a safe location.
How does the system for students going to independent schools under current statute and court rulings, how does that work?
Security alert, security alert. A hostile intruder is in the building. Law enforcement is responding to this event. Remain in a safe location and wait for further instructions.
I think I might just name that that's very unsettling, even when we know it's a test. And I am feeling empathetic for our students in this very moment. So just
Security alert, security alert. A hostile intruder is in the building. Law enforcement is responding to this event. Remain in a safe.
As a former teacher, changing the subject, always a good way to avoid answering questions.
I've only had the experience of being a sub with deep gratitude for the work that our educators do.
So your question, I think, I know you're
Security
asking.
alert, security alert. Hostile intruder is in the building. Law enforcement is responding to this.
I want to answer your question, but I'm also mindful that it relates to the next rule, and the board chair should probably join me in answering that question. And so I will look to the chair, like, do you want me to answer that and ask, do you want to shift to 2200?
Law enforcement is responding to this event.
Well, the reason for my question is to understand
Yes,
what people generally believe is how things work.
yes.
And then the next question, of course, will be, and how is this?
Security alert, security
So,
alert.
we,
Hostile intruder is in the building.
okay,
Law enforcement is responding to this event. Remain in a safe location and wait for further
Several
instructions.
questions up to be answered in
Sure.
an orderly fashion.
absolutely. And I will note that it is not unsurprising that this committee is asking those questions in the context of EQS. The board received a lot of comments with regard to EQS and its application to independent schools.
Security alert. Hostile intruder is in the building. Law enforcement is responding to this.
Appreciate that. That's a helpful question.
Yeah,
Because when we ask the next question about what happens now, it's that the answer will be in the context of any new legislation that we've passed and
Security alert. Security alert.
any rulings that the courts have
Law
made
enforcement is
which
responding
would
to this event.
upset,
Remain in a safe location and wait
change,
for further instructions.
or modify what the public currently believes to be the process.
right,
And I want to make sure that I, as a member of this committee,
right.
understand what is going to be different in part or in whole or somewhere in between as a result of these new rules. What's going to be different?
We can speak to what will be different in the 2200 rules, but I think one important action that the board took that you might reflect on is that it was asked 2 years ago, nearly 2 years ago, to apply all of the Act One equity components that we've included in the education quality standards. And the board was asked by the Act One working group to apply those through the education quality standards to independent schools. The board doesn't have the authority to do that using the process that it has to make rules for public schools. And so the board very intentionally said, we will achieve the same end by simultaneously opening up the rule series so that they may do the same thing and apply all of the new requirements from Act One to independent schools. And I think my point in telling you this is I think it signifies that the board is very aware that it only acts with the authority to make rules that the legislature has given it. And it has two distinct grants of authority. one to oversee rules related to public schools and one related to independent schools. And it's not insignificant that they open the rule series at the same time in order to achieve the same equal application of these changes. So your question about
Separate system.
they are separate systems governed by statutorily by separate requirements of board activity. One is to create education quality standards through rules. The other is to create a process to approve schools, which obviously is the topic of the next rule series. So you're correct. There are two different systems to implement those, there are two different mechanisms to implement those systems that the board has responsibility over, and they've exercised both of those in the last 2 years.
And they're substantially equal?
I don't think that's the question that the board was charged with addressing. They're charged with creating the rules to implement what the legislature has directed.
They're not obliged to consider the possibility of having separate systems and whether or not they are equal.
Yeah.
So it might be helpful to understand our process as a committee, because the recommendation in the draft that was presented to us from the Act One Working Group applied it to all schools, public and private, in their recommendation. We set that aside, understanding that was going to be very polarizing, and we looked at the rules. One, we didn't have the statutory authority to make that distinction. That really would reside with you all in your roles and responsibilities. For us, taking that recommendation and putting it through the lens of, is it within our statutory authority? We said, even that, let's set that question aside. It will prevent us from being able to look at these rules from the framework of what are the right standards based on Act One. And that was the entirety of our work until the very end of the committee process, where we said, this is unresolved within our committee. How does the full board see that question? So our look at the standards were the right standards for all Vermont students. When we introduced our draft to the board, the full board, we invited Representative Coach Christie to come and speak to us about legislative intent, because we wanted to understand, what did the legislature mean when crafting Act One in how it should apply. And he made clear that it was intended to apply to all Vermont students. The mechanisms we then had available to us to ensure that happened are the EQS, Ed Quality Standards, which apply to public schools and independent schools choosing to comply with education quality standards, and the independent school rules. So they show up in different parts of statute to give us our statutory authority. The majority of the board voted that this application of Act One should live in its two separate places in a manner that similarly recognizes the language and work that had gone into EQS. I think Jennifer and Sarah will describe, and I had the unique privilege, Sarah and I, of serving on both committees, if you will. Sarah served both committees, and I physically served on both committees, the EQS and the Independent School Rules Committee. So Jennifer will describe it as a lift and shift. We crafted the education quality standards to accurately honor the work that had gone before us with the contributions of a very diverse working group to bring us recommendations. We cycled back with practitioners, the public, the Act One Working Group, and others to ensure, as we were modifying these rules, incorporating all the public comment, we were making sure they retain their integrity. Then who it applied to, the state board decided it went in two separate places. And we tried to mirror, to the extent we could, without compromising that integrity, what is said in independent school rules. So that, I think, will be Jennifer will take my seat and I'll sit over there.
They were applied equally.
They were applied as equally as could be reasonably done within law.
Mr. Chair, I'm reminded of some story about trying to put a camel through the eye of a needle. And everyone I have spoken to about the work that you have done is that no one has tried harder and with more good faith to put the camel through the hole in the needle. And most people understand how schools are funded today. Locals vote on a school budget. They know what it's going to cost and how it's going to affect their tax rate. And then that's how the school operates. You go to the school and you knock on the door and you say, "Here are my kids." And they go in and they are subject to the current laws. In this case, and under the rules that you have presented us, if I go into a independent school and I say, "Here's my kid, I would like him to go to school here," what might prevent that from happening?
This doesn't create any additional opportunity for school choice, if you will, where a public school district, a town doesn't operate pre-K-12, that whether there exists choice and what that choice is for students in grades that are not operating in a school district or a town is not changed at all by this. I will say we did some clarification around when students are tuitioned out because it's allowed for within the district. The local education agency still retains responsibility for the effective implementation of these expectations for students. So there'll be some reporting that comes back to the school district. It might go through the AOE and to the school district, but those students that are publicly tuitioned are required to take statewide assessments, for instance. So some of that language got a little bit more clear in this revision of the education quality standards. But I think the crux of that question might be more appropriately addressed within the independent school rules in terms of, funding and when it is or isn't available. That is deeply unpacked within the independent school rules. Nothing in the education quality standards changes whether or not a student can go to an independent school.
So the independent schools have the authority to make their own decisions unfettered by.
No, they can't, but I'm not meaning to be evasive. I'm just very mindful that that's part of the testimony for the rules that we have next and the changes that have been made to be very clear about the non-discrimination components of those rules. And I'm just hesitant to shift to it because I'll literally shift.
Mr. Chair, I'm reluctant to interfere with the way in which the decisions you've made to try to make this as clear as possible.
Yeah.
But it's clear that the two things are linked somehow, and you can't explain one without the other. Is it outside the procedure to honor the motion made and ask that the maker of the motion wait until we've heard the second half of how this system works before we vote for the first half without having listened to the second half?
I think that's fine.
Yeah, you can hold the motion open and then take testimony on the second roll and then just take the motions in order.
Without objection.
Fine.
Thank you. So are you ready to move to the next?
If my question will be answered in the next thing,
Excuse me,
give it away.
Senator. Does anyone have any more questions for this rule? Okay, thank you very much.
I'm not going far, so should they arise.
You're actually welcome to stay out there and get pulled up here.
And I will at least shift out of the middle. How's that?
Is that part of my job description? Hello.
Okay, so now we're in a presentation on 20, let me get this right. 23P37, independent school program approval. Right, and you also had an extension.
Yes.
For, let's hear the rule now of the extension.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. For the record, I'm Jennifer Beck Samuelson. I'm the chair of the Vermont State Board of Education. Thank you all for this opportunity to address the committee with regard to the board's proposed updates to its Rule Series 2200, the Independent School Program Approval. I've served as the chair of the 2200 committee, both in its last iteration as well as the current iteration. And I'm joined here today by Attorney Sarah Buxton, whom the board retained to assist us with our rulemaking. I also want to extend my gratitude to Kim Gleason as well as Tom Lovett, the two other board members who, again, the three of us have served on both committees for 2200 with the updates that have happened over the course of the last few years. As the committee may recall, Rule Series 2200 was recently updated in the spring of 2022, largely in response to Act 173 of 2018. The board has now further amended the rules for three primary reasons. One, to implement the principles and goals of Act 1 of 2019. Two, to create a requirement that independent schools, as a condition of their continued approval, must complete and submit annual assurances of their compliance with the rules. And three, to provide a comprehensive framework of requirements for accrediting agencies that they must meet in order to be recognized by the board. During the rulemaking process, the board complied with all public notice, hearing, and public comment requirements. All meetings were properly warned and open to members of the public, and public comment opportunities were provided at every committee and full board meeting. In addition, the board held 3 public comment hearings on the proposed updates to the rule last fall. In total, the 2200 committee met 4 times prior to filing the proposed rules with Lcar and 10 times thereafter to consider comments received. Critically, and this may go to Senator McDonald's comments, for public comments that pertain to Act 1, the committee considered public comments that had been filed with this rule series, as well as public comments that were filed with Rule Series 2000, the Education Quality Standards, or EQS. We revised the proposed rules to address many of the specific comments received, and our goal was to align the language in both the EQS and 2200 as they pertain to Act 1 related language. As you consider the rules before you today, note that the board did not make substantive changes to all parts of the rule, opting not to substantively revise or update language that we did not take testimony on. Thus, changes were not made that pertain to higher education, pre-kindergarten, tutorial programs, etc. Further, in crafting the updates to these rules, the board worked diligently to implement legislative intent while staying within the confines of our statutory authority. The updates were carefully drafted with input from our education partners, and they have the support of multiple stakeholders. Finally, the board voted the rules out by unanimous decision. At this point, I can turn to the slide deck, which I believe was included in your packet, but understanding that you have a busy agenda this morning, I'm happy to jump right in with questions, and I look forward to moving this through to conclusion. Thank you.
Me?
I guess it's time we go back to the question of, the public knows how the school systems work. How does this change that?
So this changes, and I'm speaking with regard to the independent school rules. This changes and builds on the work that the board completed 2 years ago, because now we are implementing Act 1, which is the public, it was an act relating to public schools. And as Kim mentioned, the work started, I'll just build the timeline for you. The Act 1 working group spent 2 years crafting language. They were given pretty broad discretion by the language of Act 1 to look at any statute, rule, regulation, and they chose to look at the education quality standards. They spent 2 years crafting the rules that then were proposed to the board. At that point, the board tasked the Education Quality Standards Committee with implementing those updates. And the EQS committee spent 1 year working on updates before it came back to the board. And then we've spent the past year working on both EQS and 2200 simultaneously, because it was really important to the board to have the same substantive language in both sets of rules, which could only be accomplished if both rule series were open at the same time.
I think what you're asking is what's changed for the public. There's one important change that the legislature asked for that the board brought into this rule series. Annually, every approved independent school must submit an assurance of compliance with these rules. Previously, a school would go 5 years before it was reviewed, and the board would determine whether or not they would stay on the approved list. Now, according to a timeline that the board has designed to align with the public's interest in enrolling a student, knowing that they're making these decisions in March, April, May of any given year, there will be more information available as to two things. One, whether or not the school has submitted that annual assurance that they are in compliance with these rules. And it sets forth a process to accelerate a board decision on whether or not that school may maintain their approved status if they fail to submit such an assurance of continued compliance. And so from the public's perspective, that is what is different.
So you, if I may, and
Yeah, yeah,
make a oath
yeah.
to obey the Constitution.
Yes.
And once you've done that, everything is gonna happen the way it's supposed to happen?
That's right. And that's the same thing. I have, for example, a copy of what superintendents provide to the Agency of Education on an annual basis. It's a very lengthy assurance form. And it says, I assure that our schools are complying with this set of rules, that we've provided this service, that we do these things and have these fire drills. It mirrors that same process of annually requiring the headmaster, or in the case of public schools, they have to submit through their superintendent assurances of continued compliance. That did not exist before these rules.
So if the public school provides the assurance of whatever, and
Continued
then
compliance.
fails to comply with what they have assured
Right.
is gonna happen, what's the consequence?
So we've addressed in both of these rules.
Just
Yeah. We've addressed in both of these rules a tightened process for addressing non-compliance. I'll start by just reminding this committee, the board is not responsible for compliance. The Agency of Education is assigned the duty of ensuring that schools, both independent and public schools, comply with the laws. In the public school process, as we indicated earlier, there is now a very clear process for citizens or parents or interested persons to make a complaint or to provide feedback, whatever mechanism that they choose to offer their feedback. They make that directly to the school. The school is required to address it and then report publicly on how they address it. There is a more clear process now for how anybody, parent, citizen, legislator, can look at something that's going on in an independent school and say, I don't think they're following those rules. In Rule 2200, there is a way, it's very clear, you may submit a complaint to the Secretary of Education and it shall be investigated. And it lays forth the process for that investigation. So I think that answers your question. What happens if there isn't compliance? There are investigations and consequences. In the context of independent schools, it leads to a recommendation, if appropriate, from the secretary to the board to suspend or revoke approval. And just to remind this committee here, the legislature several years ago created a requirement that, I don't know if it's called a moratorium, but you said that no new independent schools may be initiated for a time, right now, no new independent schools can be created or approved. So the consequence of either having your approval revoked or suspended is high. And I would posit that the board considered that and knew that independent schools would take complaints pretty seriously and any investigation from the Secretary of Education seriously.
And so just for your reference, complaints and investigations, due process hearings, that's listed in Rule 2226.2, which is on pages 18 and 19 of the rule series. And then also with the annual compliance assurance, that's in Rule 2223.4, I believe. And the process there is if the school does not timely submit its annual assurance process, which, by its name has to happen every year, the school is notified and the secretary will bring this before the board for the board to conduct a hearing on whether or not to revoke that school's approval status.
And there are significant timelines. It isn't just you need to do it annually. It says by February 15th. And if the school doesn't do it by February 15th, again, with an eye toward the fact that the public needs to know before they enroll their student in their child in a school, whether or not that school is continuing to abide by, for example, the non-discrimination requirements.
Mr. Chair, I'm trying to get back to, you have your kid, you have hold the hand, take them to the public school. You say, my kids, here's my kid to go to school here. And, something happens and then they're in school there. When you take your kid by the hand, you take them to an independent school and you say, here I am, and here's my kid. I want my kid to go to school here. How does it happen as automatically as it does in the public school?
So a couple of things that you mentioned there, and I'll try to sort of unpack both of them. With regard to a public school, keep in mind that we have therapeutic schools, which serve a really important purpose. So just because a child lives in a particular town doesn't necessarily mean that that child is eligible to go to that public school, right? We also have CTE centers, which, depending on the center that is involved, they are also allowed to interview students, review the transcript before they decide whether or not to accept that student. So, there is some room to breathe in the public school system. But to your question with independent schools, this is laid out in Rule 2229. This was language that Tom, and I worked on culminating 2 years ago, and we brought those changes before Lcar in the spring of 2022, where we laid out that process for what does it look like for a student to be accepted by an independent school. And what we crafted with a lot of testimony and a lot of discussion is recognizing that independent schools are by their very nature independent. We have ski academies, we have regular schools. What we require is that they put the process by which they will consider a student, and they need to include that. I think we used to require that it's published. It has to be distributed to families and
education support teams, parents, students, prospective students.
So they need to have a policy that needs to be non-discriminatory, and they need to follow it.
And in order to receive public tuition, they must not discriminate based on special education. They have to demonstrate to the agency and then get approval from the board. In order to receive tuition, they have to show that they can serve the needs of students with special education needs. And that was the crux of the change 2 years ago with regard to showing up at the door. Just because your child has an IEP, the school can't discriminate against you for that.
And critically, whether that child is on an IEP or not is not known to the school until after the student has been accepted. So the student applies, student is accepted. If the student is on an IEP at that point, that becomes known to the school, and they then work with the LEA to ensure that the student's special needs are being met. But that's not known before the school accepts the student, because we really wanted it to be fair.
Mr. Chair, in the past, people have gone to independent schools and been asked to sign documents that they don't intend to ask for IEP services or things of that. So my question is with the spirit of understanding that doesn't happen anymore.
If you're gonna get public funds, it doesn't.
Well, if it does, if there are
Right.
circumstances in which it still happens, I'm sure you would be telling us about that and how you've been opposed and guaranteed that it won't happen to the best of your ability.
So if a school is seeking public funds, they would not be able to engage in that conduct without violating the rules.
Okay, so I'm there. Do these schools charge tuition to me when I show up? If it's, if I'm in a district where I'm free to go anywhere? You know, you're not in a designated school that's been approved by the 2 municipalities, et cetera, et cetera. But if I'm in a place where I can take my kid anywhere, what are the circumstances that permit the independent school to say, nah, no, we don't want to take it, but we don't want to take your kid, and we won't? What are the circumstances that permit that to happen?
So again, there's a process that's laid out in Rule 2229 that sets forth how a school can conduct its admissions process. And it needs to be distributed to parents and prospective families and members of the student's education team. It needs to be followed. There's a process for if it's not followed. And if there is an issue of capacity, because, you know, maybe a school has, you know, a classroom that will only accommodate X number of students, what happens when Y number of applicants want to, you know, sit in that classroom? They need to have a process that, again, is, you know, distributed, that sets forth how they will make decisions for, you know, when capacity is not sufficient to meet interest.
And that is reviewed by the agency and must be a specific finding of compliance before the board approves that or reapproves the school during the approval process. And so there's a list of specific findings that the board has to make after the agency has reviewed the application, gets copies of these enrollment policies and a whole variety of documents. And they sit in front of the board, they provide their report and the evidence. The school can participate in that hearing, and the board can't approve or reapprove the school until it has made those findings. And we've made those a little bit more prominent in this rewrite of the rule to make it very clear that you can't be approved until these findings have been made by the board. And an enrollment policy is one of them.
And when they found what they found, what are the things that permit them to say no?
The board to say no? Well, if the board saw something that said, you know, it was very clearly discriminatory, like we're not going to take BIPOC students. We're going to keep ratios in our classroom. I think that would be of the category that would violate the rules and violate the law. So that would be an enrollment policy that wouldn't let that probably wouldn't lead to a finding of compliance.
Could they say they're full? Don't have any more room?
I think they would have to say what they're going to do when they meet capacity. So whether it's a lottery or with open seats, whether or not they permit siblings first. I mean, in the same way that there are enrollment policies that generally public high schools make because they have the limited public school choice program as well. I think it's like 5 or 10% of a school. So they have to have policies in place that describe what happens when you're full. And this follows that same process.
Weeks.
I'll speak to Senator McDonald's concerns. We took testimony on on this issue in the Senate Education Committee. And I know, we're dealing with the rule now, trying to decide if the rule is appropriate or not. The approved independent schools saw this coming and moved ahead to adjust their enrollment considerations. I mean, they're trying to adhere to the spirit of a rule that's not formally approved, but it's in process. And I'm wondering if it's appropriate for the board to comment on how those schools may have accelerated their, let's call it compliance, pre-compliance. It may help Senator McDonald's concerns. Is that appropriate to comment on?
Sure. And I will say uniformly, the board received support from the independent schools for these updates to 2200. We took testimony from St. Johnsbury, from Burn Burton, from Long Trail, from Linden Institute. We also had, I think, the head of school from a number of independent schools, Visa. All we heard was support for the changes that were being proposed in the rule. And what we also heard from Visa was that many of its member schools were already engaged with this work that was being contemplated by the rule.
In the summary of oral comments in your packet, you'll see that there are headmasters of schools who have said many of these elements are already in the works. And that contributed also to the board's assessment of the economic impact. I'll also note that there was one commenter who was a supporter of a Christian school in the Northeast Kingdom, who commented, to your point to the board, they had tried to become approved and had withdrawn their application because they felt they were having to give up a lot of their values and principles. And they think that 2200, their comment to the board, was discriminatory toward Christian schools, and they would have liked to have seen more consideration given for religious schools. The board did not accept that comment, and I think it speaks to some of the concerns that perhaps you were raising earlier, that the board certainly weighed considerations like this.
Mr. Chair, I have concerns trying to find out what the facts are and what happens, because sometimes when I learn those things, the concerns go away. So I've been asking questions to find out how things work and how they operate, not,
how they got.
they may have some, forward done, have some concerns. What if these schools charge tuition? Do they not? Or how do they, or does everybody get charged the same, or how do they work things out?
Yep, every school sets a tuition, and the rules do not address the payment of tuition. The rules only address what schools can get on the list and be eligible for the statutory tuitioning program. So yes, they have tuition. Yes, it has to be clear. It would be nice if it was maybe there were a bunch of schools that said, no, we don't have tuition, but practically speaking, they all have a tuition rate. And that is part of their application process. And these rules don't direct or impact how payment is made, only whether or not a school is eligible to be on that list and receive tuition from a sending school district.
Or from parents?
Or from parents directly. But the rules really only, they could operate outside of this system as a recognized school if they simply wanted to operate a private business and take money from parents. This process is designed specifically to align with the tuitioning program in the state of Vermont. So this is really about how what schools need to do in order to have state dollars moved to them, and that is the focus and the primary purpose of the 2200 rules. It's really to make sure that the public funds have some accountability.
If I may, I just received a text. I have to make a very important call, so I'm going to take a 10-minute break here. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
It's a long progress.
Takes a break as well.
Yeah.